Do you even know your own herpes status? I'm being serious. If you ever got a blood test, there's a chance you might not have herpes. And if you ever had symptoms and got a swab test, you know if it's type 1 or if it's type 2. And if any of those questions made you think about your status and whether or not you actually truly know it, this video is going to explain everything from why it's not included on STI panels to how to actually tell what your status is, whether it's a true positive or a false positive. And if you're not diagnosed today, and you want to get checked, what is the best way to go about doing that? Because you see, after speaking with countless healthcare professionals that I do actually trust, doing hours of research on the issues with herpes blood testing, and coaching hundreds of clients to rid shame, make disclosure effortless, I want to explain exactly what doctors don't tell you and exactly what Reddit is basically confusing you about. So this is going to be herpes testing 101. I want to start off with the blood testing. Now, you see, herpes is typically omitted from STI panels simply because screening for it without an active outbreak can lead to a lot of issues when it comes to the blood test. Now, the first thing when it comes to the blood test is we have three different kinds. We have an IgM blood test. Now, an IgM is an antibody that is temporarily there and may come back later. However, it has a lot of issues because IgM blood tests, while they're still done at some older clinics, actually can't differentiate type 1 versus type 2. And the other problem is that sometimes the IgM test can pick up antibodies from other herpes viruses, such as VZV, and potentially give you a false positive. So IgM tests are something that should be avoided. Now, if you have been tested in the past, I urge you to go back, check out whether you had an IgM or an IgG. If it was an IgM test, please disregard it entirely and try to get an IgG. However, if you do have an IgG, leads to our next potential problem, which is that IgG is typically longer-term antibodies, which will show up. However, when it comes to IgG tests, some countries, Canada, UK, places like that, and even some clinics in America will just simply give you either a positive or a negative test result. Now, the problem here is that some people can test positive, not even have herpes. Some people can test negative and actually have herpes. So you're probably asking me like, well, how do I even figure out my status then? Some tests are going to give you what's called an index value. Okay, now this is just simply a number. Okay, that seems really easy, right? No, it actually is going to get more and more complicated. Essentially, looking at our index values, which some of you watching this right now have on your results, we have anything that is going to be smaller than essentially 1, okay? There is a pretty good chance that it's a true negative. However, this could fluctuate throughout the course of your life, go into the positives, go back into the negatives. It's honestly a huge mess. However, pretty good idea that this is likely a true negative. Now, anything above 3.5, okay? So could be 28, could be 128, could be 7. Likely a true positive, okay? So whether you've had an outbreak or not, if you have a high index value for either type 1 or type 2, it's likely a true positive. The issue, however, with the herpes blood tests is that a lot of times people will end up getting index values somewhere between 1.1 and 3.5. Now, there's been studies done. About 57% of people who have an index value, likely that's closer to 1.1 than 3.5, are false positives. But how do we figure that out? Well, there is a third test, which is called the Western blot blood test. Now, this is only really offered at the University of Washington, or there are some other places out there that I'm sure do a Western blot, but it's not a commercially accessible, just go to the clinic, get a Western blot done. You have to like send your blood in, and then they do like 3 different doctors, all do different tests on your blood. However, this is basically as accurate of a test as we can get. And that's what they've used to confirm that 57% of these low positives are actually false positives. So how do you get diagnosed? The best option is, I don't know. It's to go and try to get a blood test that gives you an index value, And then based on your index value here, establish whether or not you likely have herpes, unless you were to actively have symptoms, which can give you a better idea. Now, if you're watching this right now and you want me to dive deeper with you into your exact situation, whether you're diagnosed, whether you're not diagnosed, I'll leave a link down below in the description box to book a call with me and we can figure out your exact situation. But if you do happen to have symptoms, like I did when I got diagnosed, you likely have two options. You have a swab test, which is going to just be taking a Q-tip or some sort of diagnostic tool, rubbing it on your outbreak, testing that for the active virus, okay? Now, the best option is what's known as a PCR swab. Now, this swab takes a bit longer. The gold standard, maybe not available across the board everywhere just because of like laziness or just because of, doctors don't really give a shit about herpes. But this is the best option. Second option is a culture test, pretty similar in terms of a swab. The only issue here is that sometimes if the outbreak is healing, you don't get enough virus on the actual Q-tip or the swab, or there's improper handling of it. Sometimes you can get a false negative, which basically means like the swab didn't pick up enough virus on there, but you still have herpes. So my best advice, these are both great. If you have symptoms, it's better to go as soon as you can to get a swab test before it starts actively healing or before it goes away and you can't even do a swab test entirely. Now, the best way here is to, I guess, have a combination of both of these results so you can kind of pinpoint here. However, when it comes to differentiating HSV1 versus HSV2, culture and PCR, it's going to work perfectly. So if you have a genital outbreak, you do a swab test, it comes back for type 1, you have genital type 1. Okay, there's no mistake. You come up positive for type 2, you have genital type 2. The issue with differentiating what type you have or what your actual diagnosis is that when it comes to a blood test, which will go back with our index value IgG ones, is that if you come up positive for HSV1 on your blood test, let's say you get maybe 116 index value HSV1, and you have no history of, getting cold sores, if you don't know, you don't actually know whether you have an oral infection of HSV1 or a genital infection of HSV1. So if you're watching this video and you're saying like the whole herpes thing is crazy, how do I even know my status? I understand. It's actually quite a mess. And the interesting thing is going a little bit now into why people are not tested on STI panels and how this is actually making things into a bigger problem. So we have the blood tests suck. Okay, that's number one for why it's not included. Number two is that nothing to treat. So if you just get a blood test and you're screened for HSV and you don't have symptoms, you genuinely have nothing to do. You just have now been told, I have herpes. Well, what now? You don't have really outbreaks unless you have them in the future to treat. And telling you that you have herpes isn't going to necessarily change your lifestyle as much in terms of protecting others. You're probably still going to have the same life. So that was what it was. It doesn't change behavior. Doesn't change behavior. And number four is the real kicker, okay? They don't want to test you because it's going to psychologically impact you if you never have symptoms. So I've thought about this for many hours. There's a psychological impact of telling you that you have herpes when you don't have any symptoms, when it's not going to impact your life, which then prevents people from knowing their status, all this uncertainty, which then causes hysteria, which then causes not being aware of when you're having an outbreak, if it's mild, lack of disclosure, chaos when you give someone herpes accidentally, which then leads to a lack of testing, which then leads to someone else having nothing to test, which then leads to not changing someone's sexual behavior or their protection levels, which then leads to an increased psychological impact. So, a psychological impact of not telling someone herpes furthers the psychological impact, and it's one big miss. And it makes me confused about how we got to this point because the lack of testing furthers the herpes stigma and furthers the confusion. And the best advice, if we're not going to cure herpes, if it's not easy to do, is just come up with a better blood test, something that actually establishes the majority of people's status so that we either all get diagnosed and are like, oh, wow, this is so common, or people can actively figure out their status without being uncertain about IgG or antibody levels or index values or all this stuff, or make the Western blot available everywhere. So to summarize this video, if you want to figure out your status and you do want to get screened for herpes, go to a clinic, specifically ask for an IgG antibody herpes test that's going to give you an index value. Okay, you'll have those numbers. If it is below 1, likely a true negative. If it's between 1.1 and 3.5, 57% of those are false positives. If it's closer to the 1.1, try to get another test at some point, maybe a couple weeks later. Or if you do want to try for certain, go get a Western blot. You can connect with Terry Warren online. She can get you one. If you're sitting here right now and you actively have symptoms or you suspiciously get recurring outbreaks and you're not really sure what it is, the best advice is go do a swab test. Ask for a type-specific swab test. Could be culture, could be PCR. What you don't want to do is not get diagnosed, because a lot of people out there are going to be living more in discomfort of uncertainty about their status than they are figuring out their diagnosis and then moving forward. Now, if you are watching this video and you are properly diagnosed, I'm going to leave a link in the description box about my 3-step process that my coaching clients have gone through to rid shame, make disclosure effortless, and attract a loving partner.